Howdy folks, I'm Mark. I make stuff. Today we're diving into part 3 of our Swatchity Code Along series, Profile Edit. And again, in case you're wondering what Swatchity is and all that other stuff, we've covered that in previous videos, and there's probably a link. Yeah, there it is. And you can click on that and get some context, and we can just move on, right? Cool. So let's take a look at the user story. When a user logs in and clicks on the profile link, they can edit their profile information. And by that, we mean that they can edit their avatar by picking a pattern and selecting 3 colors. They can edit their bio, which is basically just emojis of colored circles. They can edit their username, which will have to check for uniqueness before saving, because in the way our data is set up, email and username must be unique. The user can set their dark mode preference, dark, light, or auto, and for now the email field will not be editable. It didn't make sense to make that editable anyway. So all this stuff is what we worked on for this, and rather than showing you the demo at the end, I wanted to walk through this to begin with, because each of these form fields is a little different. So we have our basic text input for the name. This is the same kind of thing, except it does a debounced uniqueness check, and we're going to walk through how that works. This is just a really simple language setup. Later on, we add more languages, so this is a little more meaningful. This 3-part switch here is for dark mode, right? Light, dark, auto, like we talked about. And down here, it gets really weird. We have our avatar, right? So we can select our pattern. So we have all these different patterns. There are about 34, I think. And the upper ones are locked off because I'm not of a certain level. Of course, I could just make myself a certain level, I suppose. But this is to demonstrate that I cannot save while I have an invalid pattern selected, right? So we have our buttons here to select the various colors. And we'll go over that here in a minute. Here's our bio. I'll explain what this is and kind of why this is here in a second. So let's go through the code. So first, let's take a look at the profile page itself. You can see that we have our useState instance for the form data, right? We set that the type of the form data being profile form fields right here, right? We use this in several cases. We start off with null because we don't always have the user meta when this page loads. Let's say you refresh this page, you're not going to necessarily automatically have the user meta, so we didn't want to assume that. When the user meta is loaded in, right, and we get that from the user context. When user context delivers user meta, it kicks off this use effect where we go through and say, hey, do we have all the information we need? And if we do, we're going to set this form data with a lot of the fields you expect, but also we're going to pack these colors into separate color objects, because that's going to make updating our avatar a lot easier. And then dark mode and preferred language. We have a check to see if the form has changed. So we have check dirty here, which is just going to see if the form data we're passing in meaningfully matches the user meta. And if it does, then it's not dirty. This handle OK function is the big function that saves everything, right? So update user profile is a function from our API functions file in utils. It's very simple. Look at this, just a few lines. And all it's really doing is taking our form data and posting it to this API route within Next, right? So update user meta is going to, and we've seen this in other API routes that we built so far, right? So we're checking the user session. We want to make sure we know who we're dealing with, who's making this call, and we're going to make sure that the session email matches the email that was provided in the data. And we're going to run this validate with rules function we looked at earlier. This version is a little more mature than the old one. So we have a few rules here. Required, it has to be email, minimum length, right? We say if it's less than 3, let's say for a username or a name. If it's less than 3, then it's not really started yet. So if it validates with the rules, we're in good shape. You'll notice if it's not, we throw an error. We're in a try-catch block. So if we throw that error, we're going right down here. We're going to return a 500 and success false, right? And so that Boolean that gets sent back just says false. And if everything's good, we will run this Prisma function, user meta update. Now, what's significant about this is, like a lot of good ORMs, it's doing your parameterization for you. So, unlike the bad old days when we had to do all of our own sanitization, you don't have to do that anymore, right? It just makes it so much easier. So this is very nice of Prisma to do this for us. Thank you very much, Prisma. And then we kind of undo the process we did before, where we take those color objects and we just split those out into separate fields. And they're separate fields because it makes it much easier to do search and things like that later on, which we'll go over in a later session, maybe even the next session. And remember, we return a Boolean from update user profile. So if we're successful, it updates the user meta. That's our use user context. So as soon as we update that, it's going to update it throughout the application locally for us. And it's also going to send a toaster message for success or an error. And again, notice these are Langpack keys because we're doing this in an internationalized way. Later on, I'm going to turn on internationalization once we add more languages. And it's super, super easy because as I was developing all of this, I was using internationalized text. So even though I was only targeting English, it made it really easy to add the languages down the road. So you get the idea. We use the same validation rules here on the front end as we do in our API. That's one of the really nice advantages of something like a full stack framework like Next, is that I can use the same validation rules and the same validation function on the front end as well as the API. Our JSX is just a form. You know, it's if you don't have the user meta yet, it's going to say it's loading, but it's just the form. And then each one of these elements corresponds to one of these guys, right? And so we have our kind of homebrewed grid atomic CSS to handle all this. And each one of these, we have our profile name, our username, preferred language, dark mode, avatar edit, and bio. So I'll show you a little bit about each of these. So profile name is the simplest one that we have. In fact, if this was any other application, this would just be a component in a common directory called text input, right? But because it's only being used once in this specific context, because of the kind of site it is, it made sense to just call it profile name. And you can see here, it's just an input wrapped in a label. And that's a way that we can associate the input and the label programmatically for accessibility without having to use any other kind of attributes to tie them together programmatically, right? Our handle change here, you'll notice we passed in set form data into this component so we can do whatever we want. We're using the pattern where we set form data by bringing in the previous values. And again, we use that type right there. We spread that out, and then we add our name. Profile username has some items in common with the one that we saw earlier, in the sense that we have this pattern of the label with the input nested inside of it, has a handle change. But then we also have these other elements here that you can see. We have absolute, right 0. These are elements that hang on the end here to let us know if we're unique or not, right? So loading is spinning, the anim spin, right? We spin that if we're checking. So let's do that now. Let's go Swatchity, right? And then we'll go back to Swatchity, and it goes back almost immediately because it knows that it's the same value that already existed. So it's not actually going to check. We have this markup down here is just to say, you know, the icon, if it's correct, it's in the teal color. If it's incorrect, it's in the red. We say icon closed, but it's really just an X. So above here, we have the handle change is very similar to what we saw before, where we're doing the set form We're doing set form data. We have username as well as username unique, which we have a rule for that having to be true in order to be able to save the form. And we're going to pass that along when we make the save, right? So we say is valid. Is valid is what we're going to check here in a second. So once we make that change, we're going to run this thing called debounced unique check. So up here we have our use callback, and then inside of that we have our debounce from Lodash. If the value is over a minimum length, then we say, okay, we're checking. And we use this check username function. We'll go over that in a second. If it returns true, meaning it's unique, then we set valid to that value. We set is checking to false, so we can turn off the spinning. And then we update our form data, right? To say username unique is based on that value, right? So let's take a look at is username unique. Now, this pattern is going to look very familiar. Very simple form, right? We're just taking this username and we're passing it along to our user meta unique username API rep, right? So let's check that. And you can see in our handler, we're doing similar things that we've done before. We get that server session, we check that user email, make sure it's there. We make sure that we have a username, and then we're going to look up that information, right? We're going to look up the user that was passed in based on the session. If the username we're checking is the username already associated with this user, then we return true because we don't need to check. Otherwise, we're going to ask Prisma to run a find unique check on username, which is a unique field, to see if we can find anybody else who's already using this username. And if we can't, meaning not username optional chain ID, then we return unique, right? And again, we're going to try catch, so if we run into any trouble, we just return unique false. Let's take a look at profile preferred language. This one is very similar to the name one, where it's just very short, very sweet. Instead of an input, we have a select, but it's basically the same idea. The values are coming in from a constants file, and over time we're going to add more languages to this so that this is meaningful. Right now, this is more of a placeholder. So profile dark mode, you can see this is just a simple customized switch, but it's a 3-mode switch. You can see the default is automatic, light mode, dark mode, that kind of thing. It's just 3 buttons, and every time you hit the button, it's going to update the value, right? Using the set form data, it's going to update that value. And then this element in the background is sort of the highlight that goes behind the active button. And we just use our indicator position value here. By default, it's in the middle, so we're 3 REM wide. So we go minus 1.5 REM. Just that calc. You've seen this kind of thing before. Profile avatar edit. It's going to take in these props, avatar pattern, color 123, is the pattern valid, and set form data. So all that should make sense. The is pattern valid is what's going to help display that lock and let us know that it's not valid. And we pack our avatar data based on the information that was provided. When we open the color picker, if I click on one of these, that's the function I'm going to use, right? So I open color picker 1, 2, 3, right? So we pass in the number to let us know which one we're using. And then we set the selected color based on that. It's going to open the color picker and set which color we're editing. So when I hit that OK button on the color picker, it's going to know what to update. And speaking of hitting the OK button, here's the function that executes, right? So it says color picker, the color, and depending on which color we're actually selecting, it's going to update that information as well. And then it's going to close the color picker. Very simple stuff. We have a default color. We have our change pattern function here, which basically is just, it's what happens when we hit this or this. This here, if the pattern is not valid, we use this is locked prop on the avatar. We added that to display this lock and kind of darken it a little bit so that it's clear that this isn't a valid choice, right? We have our button up, button down. They both use the same function with just a different argument. We're passing in either a positive one or a negative one, right? So here are our three colors. We say profile color edit, but basically it's just those three dots. And if you click on one, as we saw before, it will open our color picker. So our color picker, I did not want it to spell out how it worked. I wanted people to have to kind of discover it. The 8 colors, we have 9 colors here, as you can see. This is our OK button. This is the currently selected color. Let's go with this maroon. Ooh, let's go with green. Let's go with darker green. Ooh, brown. So you can kind of see that I'm able to morph the color. I'm not able to set the color exactly. Absolutely did not want to make an app where you could enter an HSV value, an RGB, or a hex color value. That wasn't the point. I wanted you to have to work at getting the color you wanted. Like that is legit the color I want. The way these colors work is this generally will shift the hue to the left. This will shift the hue to the right. This will get a little lighter. This will get a little darker. A little less saturated, a little more saturated, and a random grayscale and a random full color. That's all there is to it. So the color picker is kind of the core UI mechanic or game mechanic in the whole application, right? So we're pulling in the starting color, sort of the active color. We kind of pass in a random color sometimes, whether or not it's open. Because we could just conditionally display it, but I wanted to pass in is open so that I could have is opening as a state for animation. That's how we're able to get, we fade things in. If you close it, you'll see things kind of zoom out, that kind of thing. You probably can't see it because my computer is very slow when it's recording video, but that's what's happening, believe me. Get alt colors is where we set those 8 colors that surround the OK button. Starting from the upper left here, that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you can see in the 0 position, that's tweaking the hue to the left. That's that -1. Now, the number of units that it moves it to the left is randomized. That's why sometimes you'll see changes in the color that are really drastic, and sometimes they're very minor, and that's because I wanted it to be random. So tweak it left, tweak it right. The one in the middle makes it a little bit brighter. We go tweak value up, tweak value down, makes it darker. Get random color is our random full color, and get random gray is the same thing except they're all the same values. That's this guy. And tweak saturation. The lower left and lower right are just tweak saturation. At this point, it makes sense to go through the color functions that we have running, especially when it comes to the color picker. The get random color function is something that we created earlier for creating a new account. It just gives you a default random color. Random gray is what we see in one part of the color wheel, and it's basically the same function, except we just use one value for all of them, of course. This is what I wanted to talk about, RGB to HSV, right? I credited Atonzi, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Stack Overflow. This is based on that. And then we have the function to turn HSV back into RGB, which came from a different site, 30 Seconds of Code. I found an example there that I was able to kind of morph into what we needed. So what I needed to have happen was I needed to be able to take something from an RGB value to HSV and then back to RGB that was fairly accurate to very accurate, right? And if it wasn't accurate at all, which is what I had at first, that wasn't going to do us any good, right? So once we have everything in HSV, then we can use these tweak functions that you saw earlier. Tweak hue based on this direction. Same thing here. We're going to tweak the saturation. We're going to do the same thing. We can see in these tweak functions that we have RGB to HSV. We run our manipulation of the HSV, and then we send that back to RGB and return that. If I click on an alt color, it will set the value of the new color, but only after we time out for about half a second to let the animation take place. Then I'm going to set the color, this use state kicks in, and we set those alt colors just like we did. For all that talking I did, the JSX is actually pretty simple. We just have a single OK button, and then we map through those 8 different positions. We pass in the appropriate props, including this POS style, position style, and that's what will let the system know where to place it to get the effect that we want, right? That's how that works. And this is the thing I probably spent the most time on, because it's super fun to play around with, but also I wanted to make sure that the feel of it, for the lack of a better term, the game feel of it was something I really wanted. So that's the avatar edit and the color picker. So the bio here, you can see these are little chips that you might see in other UI like tags or categories, but usually those you can only add them once. In this case, you can add them as many times as you want, because it's kind of like a keyboard, as if each of these is a word or a hieroglyph was the idea. It's kind of a parody, I guess, of a Twitter bio or a Facebook bio, because it really doesn't matter what's here. No one's really going to read it anyway. These are just emojis, but what gets stored in the system are single letter items. So yellow, white, orange are Y, W, and O, for example. And then we have get color emojis is going to take the string, your bio string, and turn that into legitimate HTML escape codes for emojis. And then you just have these buttons here that allow you to, and we have that hover zoom here, and then we just kind of spin the close button. It's kind of obnoxious, but I love it. Let's change our pattern real quick. We'll change our pattern, and then we're gonna update our profile. Profile saved successfully. The OK button goes away. And we go up there, and there's our avatar right now. If I had changed our username, it would be up there too. But that's how that works. So what's next on the agenda? We're going to be talking about SW004 feed, and that is not just about having lunch. It is about the Swatch feed that you see when you go to the home page. If you're logged in, you can see the liked page, which is going to be all the swatches that you've liked. You'll see featured swatches, and you'll also see mood. And we'll go over what that means later. What are mood colors? I don't know. So that's all we've got for now. See you in part 4.